Welcome everyone. We'll have a few minutes while you're all coming through out of the waiting room and then we'll get started. You'll already be on mute, so settle yourself in and we will kick off in just a moment. Thank you everyone and welcome to ACRM and RDAA's webinar this evening on the opioid prescribing program. We have got some very special guests with us this evening, but to kick us off, Professor Dennis Pashen is going to manage our webinar this evening. A couple of pieces of housekeeping. This webinar is being recorded and you will be able to review this tomorrow onwards on the ACRM and RDAA websites if you would like to replay any of that. You can use your Q&A button, which you will see on your screen this evening, to ask our panelists any questions. And our chair and our moderators will review those and try to collate them if we're getting some themes so that we can answer your questions as efficiently as possible for you. If you have the need for any assistance, of course, shoot a message through and the team will be able to help you. There will be a survey that will follow this that you will get as a result of having registered for this evening. And one final thing, please remember to keep your video off and stay on mute and use all of our other functions to be able to communicate this evening. I'm going to hand over to Professor Dennis Pashen, who will introduce our guests this evening and take us through our webinar.
Thanks, Michelle. Welcome, everybody. I'd like to first of all to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we are tonight, and the elders past and present and in the future. We have two very interesting guests tonight. Dr. Grant Pegg, the Assistant Secretary of the Pharmacovigilance and Special Asset Branch. It's a bit of a mouthful, Grant. We'll have to get you a shorter title. He's the Assistant Secretary of that particular section of Therapeutic Goods Administration, which is part of the Department of Health. The branch has the responsibility for post-marketing medicine and the safety, risk management and adverse event reporting. And he also manages medicine shortage and facilitating access to the unapproved products. So a very busy portfolio, Grant, so welcome on board.
Thank you.
And our second guest sitting next to Grant there is Freya Waddington, who's the Director of the PBAC Outcomes and Implementation section of the PBAC. And she's, I'm not sure exactly what that means, Freya. It's a bit obscure for us poor little rural doctors. So I'll get you to kick off, Grant, and then when you've finished, hand over to Freya. And then at the end, we'll get people to provide questions, which we'll hope to get answered as we go through. Thank you, Grant, if you want to take it on.
Sounds great. Well, thanks very much for the introduction, and thank you for the opportunity tonight to speak about the regulatory reforms as they relate to opioid medicine. So I'll just wait for my presentation to come up and then we'll get started. Okay, next slide, thanks. So this slide is demonstrating the TGA activities that I'll be talking about tonight are just one part of a much larger puzzle of activities that are being undertaken at the Commonwealth level, but also at the state and territory level with respect to responding to the issue of opioid hazardous and harmful use. And I will caveat that by saying not all activities are represented on that slide. We just needed to have faith, but it's illustrative, if not exhaustive. So we'll move on to the next slide. So for those who, so someone's saying voice quality, are people able to hear me okay?
It's just a little bit digitized, Grant, so hopefully it'll get a bit clearer, but maybe just lean in a little closer to the microphone might just help a little bit. We'll see how we go.
Okay, how's that?
Just keep going and we'll let you know if it's a problem.
Okay, no problems. It sounds like lots of people are having patchy audio. Okay, hopefully that's better. Okay, so for those who don't know, the Therapeutic Goods Administration is a part of the Commonwealth Department of Health, and we have the mission to safeguard and enhance the health of the Australian community through effective and timely regulation of therapeutic goods. And that includes medicines, medical devices and biological products as well. And we have both pre and post-market functions. So pre-market for products that aren't registered or approved yet, and post-market for products that are approved for the Australian market, and we monitor the safety and efficacy of those. I understand that sometimes there is confusion about what the TGA does and its role, and so I thought it was worthwhile from the outset to clarify things we don't do. So the TGA doesn't regulate clinical practice. We don't fund the development of therapeutic goods or the supply of therapeutic goods. And we don't make decisions regarding the PBS, and my colleague from the PBS area will speak to that process in a moment.
Grant, it's Lexi. We've still got a few little issues with the audio still not being perfectly clear, but maybe I might just ask you to just turn off your camera for a moment and and see if that might help with your audio, just so that it's not working as hard at your end. So just down the bottom left-hand side, there should be a stop video.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, great. Let's see how we go now.
Okay, how does that sound? Is that better, worse, the same?
I think that's a bit
Much
better.
better,
That's
thanks.
better.
Okay. Okay, better. Hopefully it remains that way. So so on the slide for why we're changing it, I think it's widely accepted that prescription opioids are responsible for significant harm in the Australian community and also overseas as well. And this slide shows some data from the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare report from 2018, and indeed that should be updated later this year. But the report showed that people are now still saying it's breaking up. Okay. Yeah, let me try that. I think it's the connection thing now.
Just make sure that there's nothing else open on the computer, Grant, so that there's no other applications running in the background. Would certainly help, and maybe just slow down the speed of your voice. Might make it a little bit easier to understand as well.
I'm not sure if that's working.
Do you want to just try again, Grant?
Yes. Testing, 1, 2, 3.
Yep, that sounds better. Maybe just a little bit louder and closer to that mic.
Okay. Okay, shall we try again? How's that?
That sounds good.
Okay, well, is that working?
This is a problem. I don't know. Are they going to do anything?
I'm not sure.
We can hear you fine, Grant.
Okay. All right, I'll try again and we'll see how we go. We've fiddled with things and attached various things. We'll see. Okay, so I'll start again for this slide. So it's widely acknowledged that prescription opioids are responsible for significant harm in the Australian community and also around the world as well. This data that's on this slide comes from the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare report in 2018, and it's due for updating later this year. But it showed that every day in Australia there are nearly 150 hospitalisations and 14 emergency department admissions that involve opioid harm. And there are 3 deaths every day relating to opioid use. The report also showed that pharmaceutical opioids in Australia are now responsible for far more deaths and poisonings when compared with illegal opioids such as heroin. And that trend has been increasing over the previous decade. The evidence also shows that for most people with chronic non-cancer pain, opioids do not provide a clinically significant improvement in pain or function when compared with placebo. And in contrast, they carry significant risk of harm with respect to harmful and hazardous use, even when used as prescribed. Next slide. So these changes that we're talking about tonight are several years in the making, and it began with targeted consultation and workshops with key stakeholder groups in early 2018, followed by a full public consultation, which did include regional and rural stakeholders. We received almost 100 submissions during the public consultation period, including one I note from the Rural Doctors Association of Australia. And the feedback in that consultation indicated strong and consistent support for a regulatory response. There are about 8 options that were presented in the consultation paper. Not all of them were supported, but for the ones that were, we established an advisory group called the Opioid Regulatory Advisory Group, which includes representatives and clinical experts to help inform us on the implementation going forward. Next slide. So that's just a slide to show the groups that were represented and that are represented on the Opioids Regulatory Advisory Group. And as you can see, general practitioners are represented there, as are specialty clinical groups and pharmacy groups as well, and a wide variety of others. And they've been instrumental to help us with our changes. So these are the activities, and I will step through them. But first, I just wanted to mention that the overall aim of these activities are to reduce harm and to reduce inappropriate use, but also to maintain access for people who need them as well. So the activities are tightening and harmonising the indications for opioids, introduction of smaller pack sizes for immediate release products, strengthening and enhancing the warnings in the product information and the consumer information, and then some educational activities to help support those changes. And I'll go through those in a bit more detail now. So I'll move to the next slide. So the products affected by the changes are both Schedule 4 and Schedule 8 opioid products. And as you'll know, they come in many dosage forms and doses. So this relates to several hundred products on the Australian Register of Therapeutic Goods, but these are the molecules that are represented. Next slide. So just to talk a bit about the tighter indications. So up until now, the indications for opioid products in Australia have been widely disparate. And this is because the way the regulatory system works is based on an application process where a sponsor, so the entity responsible for supplying the good in Australia, will make an application. And as you can imagine, over time within a class, and this is not just for opioids, there can be what we consider to be scope creep. And in fact, in many instances, there were some historical indications which were completely out of step with evidence, and they were broadly permissive of first-line use for strong opioids. So one of the key things that was supported by both public consultation and by our advisory group was harmonising indications across the class to help reinforce that opioids should only be used when other analgesics are not suitable or have not proven to be effective. For immediate release products, the new indication emphasises that they are for short-term management of severe pain, and that does include breakthrough pain in the case of cancer and palliative care. For modified release products, the new indication states they should only be used where the pain is opioid responsive and the patient requires daily continuous long-term treatment. And in addition, modified release opioids are not indicated to treat chronic non-cancer pain other than in exceptional circumstances, and I'll cover that in a moment. They're also not to be used as needed PRN pain relief, and that's for the modified release products. Also, in recognition of the high potency of hydromorphone and fentanyl products, these should not be used in opioid naive patients because of the risk of inadvertent overdose and death. So I'll move to the next slide. So exceptional circumstances. I just wanted to take a moment to explain that we've deliberately not defined exceptional circumstances, as it is acknowledged that there may be a range of potential situations where they might apply to an individual patient. And of course, that's rightly subject to the individual clinical judgment of the prescriber. In the regulatory space, it can be difficult to capture every single scenario, and so it was thought important by the advisory group and by the TGA to have to accommodate situations that were exceptional, that didn't fit neatly within the indication. So whether opioids are appropriate for a patient with non-cancer pain will of course continue to be a clinical decision for the individual prescriber, and in acknowledging that the TGA doesn't regulate clinical practice, the changes aim to prompt prescribers to reflect on opioid prescribing practice, but they do not aim to encourage rapid deprescribing, as we understand and acknowledge there's clinical risks associated with rapid deprescribing as well. So next slide. So the opioid changes that we're talking about aren't introducing any new concepts to what is already known about best practice opioid guidelines, what is known about best practice opioid prescribing, but rather refocusing and harmonising the regulatory aspects as they relate to the product to best practice. And to that end, the College of General Practitioners and the College of Anaesthetists, Faculty of Pain Medicine, have been working to update their opioid prescribing guidelines. And I believe the Faculty of Pain Medicine guidelines are now up, and the RICGP ones are to follow. There's also a number of other activities going on as well. So the TGA is supporting the Australian Commission on Safety and Quality in Healthcare to develop a national opioid analgesic stewardship program. And some of you might be familiar with the antimicrobial stewardship program, which has had some success. And the purpose of this is to improve and build upon current frameworks, but also identify new models to allow for consistent adoption nationally. And that's particularly pertinent to the hospital setting, as we all know that much of the de novo prescribing of new opioids for new patients happens in the hospital setting, and that's a really important place where sometimes the prescribing of opioids for the acute setting can then transfer into the chronic and become more of a problem. So move to the next slide. So in addition to the changes that are happening for indications, we're also working with pharmaceutical companies to introduce smaller pack sizes. And we know that in the acute pain setting, treatment is usually with opioids is usually only required for 3 days or less. But many of the packs that are available in Australia obviously would treat for much longer than that. And so we're working with the pharmaceutical companies to introduce the addition of smaller pack sizes to help support best practice. And the aim of that is to reduce the risk of patients who are being treated for acute pain in developing dependence, but also reducing the amount of unused opioids circling the community, because there is a problem with diversion and people sharing their opioids with friends and families, which is obviously quite dangerous. I will say to that end, this is not at the expense of removing larger pack sizes. Obviously, larger pack sizes have an important role to play in people who need them. And so this is not removing larger pack sizes. Instead, it's introducing smaller pack sizes. There's also, we're also working to improve the warnings that are available in the product information and consumer medicines information. And I'll talk about that in a bit more detail on the next slide. But just the last point there was to mention that we're also working with the Pharmaceutical Society of Australia to promote new warning labels for packs. And the purpose of this is to obviously improve awareness of the harmful and hazardous use associated with opioids. But because it involves the pharmacist placing a sticker on the opioid pack, it also improves the opportunity for the patient to have another chat to a health professional about the risks associated with the dispensing and use of opioids. So this slide talks about the boxed warning. So you may be aware that boxed warning in product information is the most prominent and serious warning that can be added to a product in Australia. And unlike the United States, we use them quite sparingly here in Australia on purpose, because we do want them to have prominence when they are used. And the boxed warning, which you'll start to see progressively rolled out in product information for opioids, covers the limitations of use, obviously the risk of hazardous and harmful use, and life-threatening respiratory depression, coma and death that are associated with overdose. And it also covers the concomitant use of benzodiazepines and other CNS depressants, including alcohol. And then there's a precautions and warnings class statement that's being universally applied in the opioid product information that steps out in more detail those particular risks. But I've just called up one particular aspect of that for your information that talks about the importance, if opioid therapy is decided by the prescriber to use in the chronic non-cancer pain setting, it should be initiated as a trial in accordance with clinical guidelines. And the Faculty of Pain Medicine have certainly stepped out, what a trial looks like and what elements should be involved in that. And we expect to see that in the RACGP guidance as well. Next slide.
Grant, it's Dennis. I'll just cut in there.
Yeah.
I notice a lot of people have been putting questions on the chat line. Can I ask you to not make comments on the chat line, but do it through the little box down the bottom called Q&A. That way we can collate all of the questions, so that a lot of them are coming through are quite similar issues. So if you could please put it through onto the Q&A line. Thanks, Grant.
Thank you. And you can still hear me okay?
Yeah, you're doing very well. Thanks.
Okay, great. That's great. Okay, so I referred to some healthcare professional activities, and we're supporting a range of activities for prescribers. In fact, this webinar is one of them. And the College of Rural and Remote Medicine, the Rural Doctors Association of Australia, is developing a suite of information resources to be relevant to regional, rural and remote medical practice. We're also working with the Faculty of Pain Medicine, who have developed some really great modules of better pain management, e-learning modules, and they're being made available free. And I know the college has already secured 1,000 licenses, and there's been some good uptake for those already. So I'd encourage people to get involved with that. We're also working with NPS Medicine Wise, and again, there's a list of a suite of things that they're doing to help support these new changes as well. And this is a subset of the broad array of educational activities that are being progressively rolled out now. Next slide. So in tandem with that, we've commissioned a market research company to look into the attitudes and awareness of opioids, of opioid use amongst consumers and health professionals across Australia. And a particular focus has been in rural and remote communities, including a cohort of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And we hope that this research will be able to inform the creation of a broader public awareness campaign. And we're also looking to find any gaps in support for health professionals that need to be filled, acknowledging that the puzzle is much broader than the TGA reforms just on their own. Next slide. So this is just a slide for more information. So there's plenty of detail on the regulatory changes. So we started talking about the regulatory changes in September last year on our website, and we've been progressively adding more and more information to that, including pointing to other third-party resources, which might be useful. We've also included some PBS contacts, but my colleague from the PBS area will reinforce that, I'm sure. So I will stop there from the regulatory perspective and pass back to the chair while I swap over with Freya.
Yeah, thanks, Grant. Sorry about that. The Q&A screen was over my mute button. Yeah, look, Freya, if you'd like to run through your presentation, then we'll go into questions and answers. We have quite a number of questions in there that are pretty pertinent to this. So thanks, Freya, if you'd continue.
No worries. Thanks, Dennis. Thanks for that. I thought I'd just start off by giving a brief introduction to what I do and my role is at the Department of Health, and then I'll talk a bit more about the PBAC and then get into some specifics about the new restriction changes. So in terms of what I do, I obviously work for the department and I'm not part of the PBAC. In my role is to lead the team that looks after the recommendations that come out of the PBAC and make sure that those are implemented onto the PBS, and also make sure that they're fit for purpose and make sense and are usable for prescribers and pharmacists. So next slide. So in terms of the government objectives and what the PBS actually does, so it's obviously to provide reliable, affordable, equitable and timely access to the cost-effective but high-quality medicines. The other role of the PBS and the PBAC is also to promote the quality use of medicines, which is where these opioid changes have come into play. And obviously the changing to the restrictions into the opioid listings is as a result of all the good work that the TGA is doing, and not as a result of a new listings from the sponsor company. Next slide. So in terms of the PBAC, it's really important to note they are not a part of the government and that they are independent. They are a statutory committee, so they are nominated as part of the legislation. And currently we have 21 members and also a full-time and a deputy chair. So the membership at the moment is predominantly made up of medical practitioners, although there are also consumer representatives. I think there's one community pharmacist at the moment, and there's also a health economist. So we've got a really wide range of different specialties so that we can get some really interesting discussion and some good evidence base when the PBAC is making decisions. Next slide. So the role of the PBAC is not to actually make a decision about which medications will be listed on the PBS. They make a recommendation. This recommendation is then taken to the minister, and it's up to the Minister for Health to weigh up the cost of the medicine and the costs to the government versus the efficacy and how much good that's going to do for the Australian population. Next slide. So we've had a lot of questions that have been coming in lately, in particular relating to those opioid changes, about how the PBAC comes to their decisions and if there's any record of what's being discussed. There are records kept on the PBS website. The public summary documents for each meeting and each item that are discussed are available. And these are included via product or via meeting. So you can go and have a look at each individual discussion. Next slide. So in particular, the opioid reform details are available. So this was discussed in the December 2019 meeting. So you can go there and have a review of what was discussed and have a look at the minutes and also the original proposed restriction changes. Next slide. So in terms of the process for how the PBS monthly listings are made, obviously each month we're making changes. So we average about changes to about 20 products a month, and these can be a very simple change, or these can be very large scale changes. So each month the Department of Health provides the relevant PBS change data to software vendors, both prescribing and dispensing software vendors. And this is done at least 2 weeks in advance before the end of the month. And this generally gives vendors enough time to update their software system. The reason I mention this is because I'm sure a lot of you will be aware that this, with the opioid changes, we became aware of an issue that had never been raised to us before. And that was that there were 2 major prescribing software companies that were not updating their software at the start of every month. And obviously, this had not gone, no one had noticed it, so this hadn't been an issue previously. And now that we've found that this is an issue, the Department of Health has actively been working with these vendors to encourage them to make sure their software is updated in time to give prescribers and pharmacists the ability to make the most up-to-date prescribing decisions. We also note that because these changes are done every month, it's the responsibility of health professionals to make sure that they're checking the PBS website and also accessing email notifications in order to be up to date with the PBS changes. Because as you can imagine, communicating each change is quite a large scale requirement for us. However, it should be noted for big changes such as the opioid changes, Services Australia, who is the service delivery team on the PBS, does communicate with major stakeholders when these changes we think are going to affect a lot of people. And I understand that they did communicate the opioid changes to the RACGP, AMA, the Guild and the PSA. Next slide. So the next thing I wanted to do was to go through the changes to the restrictions, and I apologise in advance if I'm going into too much detail, but I just wanted to talk through them in a step-by-step manner so that everyone's on the same page. So in terms of the way that these were approached by the PBAC, They were classified into opioids for short-term acute therapy and also the chronic long-term use, and that was generally the slow-release opioids. They were also then classed as first-line and second-line products, and there are a couple of exceptions to those, which I'll just point out as well. So in terms of starting off with the short-term settings, these were all changed, classified as restricted benefits. So therefore, you don't need to get a streamlined code. However, when prescribing these for under PBS subsidisation, you must meet the relevant restriction criteria. So as you can see here, the clinical criteria includes that the treatment must be for short-term therapy of acute severe pain. So that's a given. So anybody who's prescribing for this must meet that first criteria. You can see then that the and the 3 or options below, that the patient must meet any of those 3 below, so that they don't need to meet all of them. So the first criteria being that they've either experienced inadequate management of pain previously using other non-opioid analgesics, or the second one being that they have a condition that is such that maximum tolerated doses of other non-opioid analgesics would provide inadequate management of pain. Or finally, any other treatment would be contraindicated or they've previously experienced adverse effects or intolerance. Next slide. So for the first line, short-term pain settings included with that same restriction drugs such as codeine, Panadine, short-acting oxycodone, things like tramadol. So for these products, we have allowed authorities for increased quantities and repeats, and I'll touch on those requirements later. And we've also included that you can access increased quantities repeats for pain related to conditions such as cancer, as we recognise that these products are commonly used for breakthrough pain. Next slide. As Grant touched on earlier, we've also introduced the new reduced pack sizes. So as Grant said, that these new pack sizes aren't removing any of the previous pack sizes. Everything still exists on the PBS. However, this does give prescribers the option to prescribe reduced packs in situations where the patient will only require 2 to 3 days worth of pain relief. Because these are only for short-term use, there is no ability for there to be an increased quantity or repeat, because if you're looking for those, you should be using the large pack size. Next slide. So also for the short-term pain, we have the second line opioids, so hydromorphone and morphine. And the restrictions for these are exactly the same as the first line setting. However, there is the requirement that first line opioids are either tried, contraindicated, or not tolerated for patients. Again, for these, authorities for increases are considered and are allowed for specific individuals, and I'll touch on those again later. Next slide. Again, we've got the equivalent reduced pack sizes there for the hydromorphone and the morphine. Next slide. So a couple of the exceptions that I touched on earlier are the use of morphine injections for preoperative care, and also the morphine sulfate pentahydrate for cancer-related pain. So those have slightly different restrictions, but they are all restricted benefits there as well. Next slide. So this brings me to the opioids for use in the long-term setting. So these are slightly different in that they are streamlined or authority required. So when prescribing these, you need to make sure that you're including that streamlined code on them so that pharmacists can dispense and claim appropriately. So in terms of the clinical criteria here, we've got the condition must require daily continuous long-term therapy. So we've had a few questions coming in regards to what is meant by continuous long-term therapy. And it's important to note that the Department of Health and the Services Australia do not have a definition for continuous long-term therapy, and it's up to the prescriber to use their own discretion when prescribing these drugs. If you consider that a month is long-term therapy, then it's within your clinical discretion to prescribe these products for those patients. So in terms of the restrictions here, it's very similar to the short-term therapy. However, there is the ability for these to be prescribed for pain directly attributable to cancer. So you can be prescribing for cancer for these chronic use medications. So down the bottom here, I also wanted to touch on the authority requirements. So you can see here that the authorities are only for increased maximum quantities and repeats will be considered for one of 3 criteria down the bottom. So this is when you need to, sorry, someone's just saying my sound disappeared. Can anyone hear me?
Yeah, you're clear, Freya.
Yeah, okay, beautiful, I'll keep going. So the authorities, so this is when you are required to call up Services Australia, and it's important to note that regular prescribing of the PBS list items as listed on the PBS do not require any ongoing calls to Services Australia. However, if you are requesting authorities, you need to call depending on the scenario. So the first line there talks about when the total duration of non-PBS or PBS subsidised analgesic treatment is less than 12 months. So basically, if your patient hasn't been on the opioids for 12 months, then you are able to apply for increased maximum quantities and repeats from Services Australia. And granted, if all the other requirements are met, that shouldn't be an issue. Option 2 is where you've had, your patient has been having opioid treatment for over 12 months. These patients are required to have review from a second medical practitioner. So I should note that this isn't a new requirement in that previously patients should have been reviewed in the first 12 months if they had ongoing therapy. The difference is now that we're requesting that that review happens once every 12 months. So it's an ongoing review. The third criteria there, which has caused a bit of confusion for some people, is basically saying that if your patient has had 12 months of therapy prior to 1 June, we're giving you 3 months worth of leeway to make that appointment for them to see another practitioner. So if you've got a patient that you wanted to prescribe for now, they've been on it long term, and you haven't been able to get them in to see another practitioner, then you've got 3 months from the date of the application to sort that out. Down the bottom, you can also see that you can apply for these authorities via the online PBS system or by calling Services Australia. And I just wanted to really encourage prescribers to try and use the online system if possible, because there have been a lot of complaints about the PBS phone lines taking too long or being really clogged up. The online system is obviously a lot quicker, and you have the ability to just fill out the questions right in front of you without waiting for someone on the phone and going through the whole conversation with them. Next slide. So in terms of drugs that are included in that first line setting for long-term use, we've got buprenorphine, tramadol, morphine, tapentadol. And again, as mentioned, authorities for increases will be considered for these. Next slide. So this is just that ongoing list. So Targin is included in that. Next slide. And all the morphines as well. Next slide. So second line drugs for long-term treatment. So these, the only difference with these is that we would consider that if you're going to use fentanyl on someone, you would have probably already tried one of the lower potency opioids first. So included in this is also hydromorphone and the methadone. Next slide. So just to finalise with some further information, I just wanted to point out on the PBS, basically it's on the PBS homepage, there is an ability to sign up for PBS news alerts. So you can just chuck your email in there, and that's the best way to be updated with any of the big changes coming up on the PBS. So any of the news items will directly get sent to you there. But also, if you have any specific feedback or wanting to talk about the changes that have occurred, as mentioned, I'm not the PBAC and the department isn't the PBAC. However, we can provide that feedback to the PBAC for their review and for their discussion when they next meet. And that's it from me.
Thanks, Freya. Look, we've had a wide-ranging number of questions there, both on the Q&A and on the chat line, probably more so than we can answer in one night. But some of the questions go about the relationship between the Commonwealth system and the state-based systems, the pharmaceutical service branch in Tasmania, for example. There seems to be a slight disparity sometimes in the prescribing acknowledgement for the separate groups. Is there any answer to that? Grant or Freya, either of you can try and answer that.
Yeah, we've had a few questions about that coming in, and I recognise that each state and territory normally have their different requirements for the prescribing of Schedule 8 medicines. I think it's important to recognise that they are very separate systems in terms of PBS prescribing. So when prescribers are calling up Services Australia to potentially request an authority prescription, that Services Australia does not share any data with the individual states and territories. So if you have already applied via a state or territory for that authority, that information isn't available to Services Australia. So you will have to potentially be providing the same information twice.
And it's Grant here. I might just comment on that from my experience with medicinal cannabis, because for my sins, I also have to look after that. And that's a good example of the difference between state and territory requirements and Commonwealth requirements. And at the end of the day, the states and territories do have their own legislation and requirements and are entitled, they have a sovereign right to make those decisions. I understand a lot of those requirements usually have to do with prescriber type and potentially patient type. In terms of there's usually cut-offs for duration, but we understand it's an extra layer of complexity.
Okay, thanks for that. There's an interesting question from a two-doctor practice, I presume in the same town, and the only two doctors. Can a patient see both on the same day, both of the doctors, fulfill the criteria with two separate consultations, so that they've met the criteria of being reviewed?
I mean, yes, that would meet the restriction criteria, if that's the best way to do it for the prescribers, and if that's appropriate at the time. Yes, that would fulfill the criteria.
Great, thanks. There's actually an interesting question here. What did the health economist on the PBAC have to say about the cost versus benefits of the changes to the PBS opioid prescribing? Some of the possible replacements, for example, gabapentin, pregabalin, are very expensive. Grant or Freya?
In terms of what they said exactly, I can't remember the exact conversation. I would say you'd have to refer to the public summary document, but I understand the TGA did do some work looking at the money side of things.
Yeah, I mean, and I will say too, there's an increasing evidence base of hazardous and harmful use with gabapentinoids as well. So they're by no means naive to similar issues.
Yep, that's great. One of the other questions is the lack of access to pain specialists. And I'd point out there are a number of people who've asked about that. There is actually an open database on Romeo for all range of telehealth specialists, including pain specialists, which we'll get the team to post. I think it has been posted on the Q&A somewhere in there. Grant, perhaps you can comment on the issue of getting pain specialists to review these patients where they're difficult to reduce opiate dosages.
Yeah, so obviously, I guess that depends on the clinical scenario, and I appreciate it's a very complex matter. And whilst improving pain specialist services outside the remit of what we're talking about tonight, I know the Australian government appreciates that's an issue, and people on the line might be aware of the National Strategic Action Plan for Pain Relief, which encompasses a whole range of measures by government. A couple of important things just to comment on that. One, and Freya, correct me if I'm wrong, but the review does not have to be undertaken by a pain specialist. It's any medical practitioner, and it also doesn't step out under what terms that needs to be done. So that could be by phone or telehealth and that sort of thing. In terms of the when it's clinically necessary to access a pain specialist, I'd probably leave that to people more adept than me. But it's it is an important consideration depending on the circumstances.
Thanks. A couple of comments have been made about the efficacy of the online authority system. Apparently there are some issues with access, time lag, and dropouts. Any comments about that?
No specific comments. So as mentioned, that's something that's run by Services Australia, who's the implement the services for the PBS. However, I can take that feedback back to them and have a discussion about it. Definitely.
Okay, thanks. Peter, you had some comments you wanted to make, I believe. Peter Rutherford.
Thanks, Dennis. I guess just to flag, there's been quite a bit of chat within the questions and online in relation to just the communication process. And probably Keen noted that there was some comments earlier about engaging with RACGP and the AMA. So I think just to flag that there was some concerns that the rural group have possibly been forgotten. We appreciate that you're here tonight, but probably just keen to make sure that all communications going forward include the rural peaks as well as the standard general practice peaks and others. So just to flag that, but that seems to be a fairly big issue that's coming through the chat and the questions.
Yes, absolutely. We recognise that and are very keen, as we have worked with Rural Doctors Association and ACRM in developing this and other resources. We're very keen to continue that relationship and working together to address issues as they arise.
There've been a couple of questions about the use of morphine in terminal care. Very little's changed from my perspective on that. Is that correct, Grant or Freya?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, we've worked closely, especially with the Powell Care groups, to make sure that access is maintained for their purposes. There are a couple of outstanding issues which we're working through to resolve, but we're confident that will be resolved.
And also just to add on there that the PBS palliative care schedule does exist as well, and we didn't actually make any changes to that this time round because there is an ongoing review of that happening.
Okay. The general questions that we've had have been around the issues of the effectiveness of opioids and suitable replacements. And whilst paracetamol and non-steroidal anti-inflammatory agents are seen as the major substitute, the point was raised that particularly in a lot of socially disadvantaged rural areas and remote areas, people have significant comorbidities where non-steroidals are absolutely contraindicated due to the comorbidities. How do you get around that with the use of or non-use of opioids to manage serious pain in those people where paracetamol and other agents aren't effective?
Yeah, look, it's a complex area, and that's why I think it was important for us to for the approved indications to accommodate scenarios where the non-opioid therapies weren't an option. But I suppose what we're doing and working with the various health professional groups is also to sort of improve education about, because there's usually always, I know there's also an issue with services, but there's always a focus on pharmacotherapy as first line when most guidelines support non-pharmacotherapy options first of all. But in situations where absolutely there's no alternative and it's a chronic non-cancer pain scenario, the current restrictions would accommodate that scenario. But it's I freely admit it's a complex situation for some individual patients.
Yeah, thanks, Grant. Freya, this one's for you. Can you provide details of how you obtain online authority authorization? Just a brief outline of how you go about that.
As in the process?
And the site, yeah.
Yeah, so as mentioned, this is actually this process is owned by Services Australia. So I can provide some more detail on that to be shared with the group after tonight. But in terms of that exact process, I'd have to refer to my colleagues at Services Australia. But my understanding is that there is the ability to sign up and a link on the PBS website, and you just go through and answer a series of questions. And if you answer the questions in the correct manner, then you're provided with the authority code. But again, I can provide more detail of that.
Yep, that'd be great. We can put that online after the teleconference. Thanks very much. There've been a few comments about the sudden introduction of this without a lot of preamble. Was this rushed through, and was there a broad delivery of information to general practice, Graham?
So I'll speak from the TGA perspective, and then Freya can talk about the PBS, because there are established processes for both. So as I explained in my presentation, we've been talking to key groups for a couple of years with respect to this, and we actually spelled out what the indication changes were in September. I think it's fair to say, though, that in the couple of months, obviously leading up to the PBS changes, there was a lot of the media and reporting and dare I say focus was rightly on the COVID-19 pandemic, and so it's, I appreciate that some of the key messages might have got lost in the ether there, but I think it was the introduction of the PBS changes in June, which I think surfaced a lot of the issues. That Freya can describe what their process is for announcing those changes.
Yeah, so in terms of rushing this through, no, when we do PBS changes, as I mentioned earlier, so this went through the PBAC meeting in December, and generally there's a lot of pressure on the department to list things as soon as possible. And because these changes didn't require any ongoing conversations from the sponsor companies, this was a fairly straightforward one for the PBAC to implement and put on the PBS website. In terms of the process for communication, as mentioned, these with PBS changes, because we are doing them so frequently and so many, we generally don't communicate those changes. However, as mentioned, and I recognise that we probably could have communicated to the rural GPs differently and probably better and will do in the future. We did communicate, or Services Australia did communicate with some of the bigger prescriber and pharmacy groups.
Great, thanks. Are there any poster or patient information leaflets available to be downloaded so that patients and the practice can distribute these about the new changes?
Yes, there are resources and fact sheets available, and we're, as I mentioned, working with our partners to create more materials as well. So I'd happily get our team to circulate to you and the attendees of this webinar various resources that are available for download and dissemination, and we expect those to continue to become available as well.
That'd be great. We've got a couple of questions about private scripts. How are they affected, private scripts for opiates? How are they affected, or are they being targeted?
So in terms of PBS changes, obviously if they're private, they don't need to adhere to any of the PBS criteria, so they can still be written as is. However,
yeah, and from the TGA perspective, obviously the approved product indications are the approved product indications, but like any medicine, we don't regulate off-label use, and if a prescriber chooses to prescribe off-label, that's subject to their individual judgment.
Right. There's absolutely no blockage on that. I've got another comment there about PROTA, which is the online thing of people having difficulties with it. Part of our problem, I suspect, is a lot of rural doctors have got very poor bandwidth, and despite Telstra's publicity that everyone gets linked via NBN, the fact is that the majority of rural areas have significantly decreased services. For example, in Queenstown, we have NBN satellite, which is great, except we have 240 days a year of thick cloud cover, and it doesn't work that well.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, these are significant issues, and the one thing we know about IT is that it fails regularly. So that's part of the problem. The other issue is about the delays with when are those messages going to be dropped about opiates prior to talking to someone? Because after you've heard it 300 times, it actually gets a little grating, and it's a whole session of your life. I think GPs feel they're not going to get back having sat there and heard the same message 300 times. Is that going to be dropped?
Sorry, Dennis, what's going to be dropped? Sorry?
The telephone message when you ring the 1-800 number.
It's
driving us crazy.
We're very happy to feed that back to Services Australia.
I'll let them know.
Yes.
Please stop.
Yeah.
That'd be great. We've got some other questions. They're mostly around streamlining codes for palliative care. But so, are there any that are still streamlined for palliative care, or they've all been put onto this new system of authorities?
So the changes for the non-palliative care schedule, so the slow release opioids generally as a whole have been moved to streamlined authorities, but there's no, if you look at the opioid medicines that aren't on the palliative care schedule, none of them specifically say for use in palliative care. However, that doesn't prohibit them from being used in palliative care.
And they would satisfy the criteria of those patients.
And those patients, yeah, would meet the criteria. So a number of those are, yeah, the streamlined authorities or the restricted benefits.
Okay. Just looking through some of the questions again. There's an interesting one here. Given that short-acting opioids are more addictive, what's the rationale that slow-release formula is not to be used in a daily PRN fashion?
Well,
right.
Yeah, I mean, that's supported by guidelines, including the Faculty of Pain Medicine. The idea being that the slow release versions should be reserved for people who are using opioids long term, and that you should start with immediate release products and titrate up.
Right. The other issue that's been brought in here is the de-prescribing and de-escalating dosages.
Yeah.
Is there any recognition of this in the various processes with the PBS and in the authority system of actually de-prescribing and de-escalating dosages?
So, in terms of to prevent rapid de-prescribing, do you mean?
Yes.
Yeah. So that's why there's the indications, the approved product indication has that exceptional circumstances clause, because we understand that there's going to be a number of patients who have been treated on potentially high doses of opioid products who don't have cancer, for that potentially they've been stable on that for years, and we didn't want the introduction of a new indication to mean that doctors felt that their hand was forced to rapidly de-prescribe those patients. However, perhaps the introduction of those might generate some thinking or force a conversation about whether an appropriate a trial of an appropriate wean was possible, and we've certainly been working with the relevant health professional groups to talk about furthering and developing some guidance about appropriate weaning.
Okay, look, thanks very much, Grant and Freya. That's our time's up, and it'll click off in a moment. Thank you, Grant and Freya, very much for your questions and answers and the presentations. And at this stage, it's right on the money. And thank you, everybody. Thank you for participating, everybody else. And thanks for all the questions. They've been very successfully listed on our system, and a lot of the answers will be posted after the webinar. So thank you, everybody, and everybody have a good night. Thanks.
Yes, thank you, everybody. Really appreciate it, and thanks for the questions. Good night.
Good night, all.